We have the apprenticeship program that's offered through Be Mindful. So that's right here in Driftwood. It's really quite a treasure to have that here in our community. You're learning with Les Crowder, who has over 50 years experience in natural beekeeping. Natalie as well is an instructor. She's a master beekeeper. There's a teaching apiary with hives, Wari style, laying straw, top bar hives, and it is such a fun apprenticeship. Is anybody here in the apprenticeship program? I'm in the program. Darren, we've got, yeah, Lolly, awesome. We've got Deb back there also. All right, that's the chat with the Mindful Beekeeper. That's it again every Monday, 7:30 to 8:30. That's on Zoom. Now, for our guest speaker, I am so excited. I have been waiting for this moment. We've got Julia Mahood. She is a Georgia beekeeper doing a presentation called The Game of Drones. If you've been in beekeeping for any amount of time, you know that drones get a bad rap. Julia is one of the few beekeepers I've been able to find who really loves drones, goes into detail about how drones are beneficial for a colony, and indeed you do want them around. So in beekeeping, you have different goals and agendas. Commercial beekeepers are going for maximum honey production. When they're in that phase of their business, drones aren't something that they want around. So we have this dialogue that has just kind of been regurgitated from the commercial beekeeping industry. What we don't find out is that oftentimes when the honey circuit is done, when the pollination circuit is done, they are then going into producing packages and nukes for people. And drones are around during that time. They actually have drone yards where they're rearing colonies specifically for their drone production. So Julia has been fascinated by the secret life of drones, and she revolutionized the method for finding drone congregation areas. These are also called DCAs, and she revolutionized this using the flying unmanned aerial vehicles, UVAs, so also called drones. We're going to call them UVAs in the presentation so we don't get the different types of drones mixed up. So she's the past president of the Metro Atlanta Beekeepers Association, an advocate for prison beekeeping programs, and she leads beekeeping in the Lee Arundel Women's Prison. She's also a graphic artist who designed the Georgia license plate, Save the Honeybee, and she was named in 2018 the Georgia Beekeepers Association Beekeeper of the Year. Julia, you'll have to let us know in your presentation. I have mapmydca.com down. I'm not sure if you founded that website, but I know that it is definitely something that you've been active on in the past, and it is a place to share DCA findings, a place to gather citizen science. So if you're inspired by this presentation, if you decide to go out and find some DCAs, you have a website that you can go to and log on a map and see where all of the other DCAs have been logged. I think it's in the world, and where your DCA is located. And while we're making Julia co-host, if we could give her a round of applause, please, for joining us via Zoom tonight from Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for persevering. Can you hear me? Am I loud enough?
Yes.
Okay, great. I know it's a real challenge to do Zoom and in person, so hats off to y'all for trying. And when I was testing the mic, I was saying how incredible that introduction was, Natalie. That was very sweet of you. That was just really, really nice. So I'm happy to be with you all tonight. And as Natalie introduced me, you know I'm going to talk about drones tonight. So I like to say that drones are the Rodney Dangerfields of the bee world. They get no respect. And there are, not just what she said about commercial beekeepers, but there are also sometimes some old timer beekeepers who, when they teach you about beekeeping, and this is what happened to me, they're like, oh, they're like deadbeats and, they're just a drain on resources and you should call all your drones. But drones are integral to the colony, and I hope that you'll learn to better appreciate them after this talk tonight. So in the basic healthy, thriving colony in the spring, you will have probably just one queen and maybe about 60,000 workers in a booming colony, and maybe about 6,000 drones. So you have a lot fewer drones at any point in the summer. And a general lineup in the colony, the queen is the tallest bee, And the workers, of course, are the smallest and the lightest, but the drones are way more than the queen. They're about a third more, and they are shorter than the queen. But the biggest difference you'll notice is they have these huge eyes, almost touching the middle, and they have a blunt-tipped abdomen, where the queen has a pointy abdomen. And here in this picture, you can see a drone fellow with his worker sisters, and see how blunt-tipped his abdomen is, and theirs is pointy. And their eyes are so huge, it's like they touch in the middle. And the workers, of course, their eyes are just on the outside. And drones only live to be about 32 days old. So yes, I think they always look like this hot guy on the right in the colony. That's what the workers see when they, in the queens, when they see the drones. So before I talk about drones specifically, I wanted to back up to some colony basics. So in order for a colony to survive, the colony must be queen-like. We know that's the most important thing. And then they have to have lots of workers. The queen can't survive without the workers, and the colony can't either. And then they have to have food stores in order to survive winter. And these are the bare minimum for survival of a single colony. But what about the colony as a superorganism? The superorganism is when there are individual organisms that have specialized behavior that together create one organism. And the honeybee superorganism is the colony. If you think about humans, we need three things, right? Food, shelter, and water to survive as individuals. But as a species, we need to reproduce to ensure survival. In a similar way, in order for the colonies, the superorganisms, to reproduce, they need drones. And when you speak of the superorganism theory, you often hear people say that the queen is the ovaries of the superorganism, and the comb is the liver, and an individual cell is the uterus, and the workers collectively working together are the brain. And in the superorganism theory, the drones are the flying testes of the superorganism. And I could have drawn that differently, and I didn't, and you're welcome. So one thing you need to keep in mind is that we always often talk about colonies needing to be queen-like. They have to have a queen to be queen-like, but that's also just as important for species survival that they be drone-like and that they raise drones. But one thing you need to always keep in mind is that colonies are not going to raise drones if they can't afford them. If they come out of winter in distress, if they have low numbers, if they have low food stores, they're not going to raise drones. So it's really the sign of prosperity if a colony can raise drones. If I could indulge in some anthropomorphism, I think of it as the workers having trophy husbands, like they're out on the flowers boasting about how many drones they can support, because it's really a sign that they're thriving. It's a really good thing. Back to the general thinking about how drones are a drain on the colony for the average beekeeper. There was a study done in Scotland that compared colonies that were given drone comb at the beginning of the season and given full access to raise drones, and those that weren't, that were limited and were not allowed, weren't given any drone comb to raise drones. At the end of the season, the drone-right colonies were a little larger, and they actually made slightly more honey than the colonies that weren't, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. But also, because beekeeping is never simple, there was another study done in Tom Seeley's lab that showed that colonies with excess drone brood made less honey. So you never know the bees with the bees, but it's certainly not cut and dry. We do know, however, that, like I've already mentioned, that for species survival, they need their drones, and the workers have a strong drive to raise drones if they're thriving and they can support them. So let's begin in the beginning talking about drones. With drones, life begins with a proper cell. Drones are larger and they need a bigger crib. Every time a queen lays an egg, what she does is she first puts her head into a cell and she feels with her two front legs, her forelegs, to see how big the cell is. And then she pulls her head out, turns around, inserts her abdomen, and she lays an egg. Now, if she felt that the cell was small, is about 4.5 to 5.5 millimeters, she's going to lay an egg that will become a female, which means that she releases an egg, it passes down by this little funny thing called the valve fold. And at that point, her spermatheca, and this is an organ in her body where she's stored all the sperm she'll need for her life, is going to release a little sperm for this egg. And then it's going to travel out her sting chamber and deposit in a cell. Now that's if she felt that the cell was small, and that fertilized egg is going to become a female. Now, if she felt that the cell was bigger, if it was 6 or more millimeters, when the egg comes down over the valve fold, she doesn't release any sperm. She releases an unfertilized egg to the sting chamber, and that becomes a male. And how do we know that that happens? we know because scientists did studies where they cut the front legs off of queens and found that willy-nilly they would lay drone eggs next to fertilized next to unfertilized eggs. So there was lots of theories about all kinds of different things, maybe the pressure, the cell in her abdomen, but it comes down to her ability to feel with the front legs. And drones, so they come from an unfertilized egg and they don't have fathers. They only have one set of chromosomes because it's not fertilized. So they have 16 chromosomes, whereas the females have 32. And this is true of all Hymenoptera, bees and wasps. They're called haploids, and haploids, obviously have one set of chromosomes, and the workers and queens are diploid. And the sex determining modes or whatever that bees use, this is the basics, but there's also another type of male drone, a male bee, and that because sex determining process in honeybees it's quite different from humans. We have X and Y chromosomes. We have separate chromosomes, but bees don't have sex determinant chromosomes. What they have is a sex determiner gene at a sex determiner locus. And on this gene, there are alleles. And the honeybees have there's thought to be about 145 different sex alleles. If you read some of the older literature, it'll say, oh, maybe there's 12 or 17, but they've discovered about 114, and they believe that there's probably about 145. So what happens is if an egg is laid, it's fertilized, it's heterozygous, and it has two different alleles. So that say the mom had an allele C and the dad had a allele D, it's going to become a female. If there's only one allele, so basically it's just the egg, it's going to become a male. So that's what we just talked about. But there's a thing where if it's a fertilized egg with the same sex allele, so they both have C, what you're going to get is a male. But these males are known as diploid drones. And diploid drones are usually a sign of inbreeding. And as we know from the Game of Thrones, inbreeding is not good. And what happens is, this is what you see as a result of it. You see this, what we call a shotgun brood pattern, where about half the cells are empty and a half of them are capped. And what happens is, quite fascinating actually, these diploid drones are destined to be failures. They're small, they're too small, and they're infertile, most importantly. And so because they've only been raised in labs, because what happens is the workers can smell that something's amiss back there. As soon as that egg hatches into the larvae, it gives off certain particular compounds that the workers can smell. And what they do is they gobble it up. So they eat it. Nothing is wasted. So they eat those larvae. And that's why only these, the ones that are capped, or end up being capped. So it's a sign that she's mated with, either she's poorly mated and about half of her sperm is related to her. So she's either unlucky or she mated with her brothers. But I would like to point out that she can, a well-mated queen can be, upwards of maybe 50 drones, right? So if she mates with 50 drones and 2 of them are her brother, that's not a big deal. You might see an empty one here and there. It's really when it's in larger numbers. So what they do is they eat them. Nothing is wasted. It's protein. And when I do talks to children's groups, I like to tell them how gentle honeybees are and how they don't want to sting you. And I paint this picture of mean wasps and how wasps can sting multiple times, and that wasps are carnivorous and aggressive, but honeybees are gentle vegetarians. And the truth is that they are gentle vegetarians, except for when they're cannibals. But we don't tell the kids that because that's a little creepy. So because the drones that you'll see in your hives are haploids and they only have the one set of chromosomes, you'll occasionally see a recessive gene expressed. And the dominant eye color in honeybees is black or kind of dark brown, but occasionally you will see white-eyed drones, or you'll see these beige, tan, and cherry red-eyed drones. Now the white-eyed drones, these are some that I've seen in my colonies over the years. And what's kind of cool, if you can see at this top picture, even the little ocelli are white. Isn't that crazy? I think that's really cool. Now the white-eyed drones, sadly, are blind. So when they fly out, they'll never fly back. And it's nothing really you have to worry about. It just means that your queen is carrying that recessive trait. And it's kind of interesting when you see them. It's kind of cool. So we have haploid drone eggs in larger cells. And when you're first learning about bees, you're taught that all larvae are fed royal jelly for the first 3 days, right? Well, it's a tad more complicated than that. The 3 different types of bees are fed 3 different jellies. So there's the royal jelly that the queens get, the worker jelly, and the drone jelly. And there's not a whole lot of difference. It has to do with the ratio of the 2 different kinds of food that she makes, the workers make. But the biggest difference in drones is that they are bigger bees and they need more food. So they're fed in much bigger amounts. And similar to workers, the last few days that their larvae, they're fed a lot of pollen mixed with honey along with the brood food. So drones are fed more, they're much bigger than workers, and they need extra time to grow into adults. And you're probably familiar with this type of chart. Everybody's an egg for 3 days, and then the larval times get are longer for drones, a couple days, than workers and queens. And then the pupal time is really much longer, so 3 or 4 more days. But one thing that's kind of interesting, we all learn this, right? You learn that it takes 16 days to make a queen, 21 for a worker, and 24 for a drone. But these numbers are not set in stone. It can take as few as 20 days for a drone to emerge, or as many as 28, 16 to 24 for workers. The queens stay right around that 16-day range. But there are 2 factors that determine how long the pupation times are, and they are temperature and food. So if the temperature is too low, or they don't get enough food, it might take longer. So we talked about how the drones are raised in larger cells, but how does this work? If bees make their own comb and are not supplied with foundation from beekeepers, they are amazing little architects. They'll create smaller cells in the center of the nest where they'll raise the worker brood, and then the cells on the periphery of the nest get larger and larger, and they'll lay the drone eggs on the edge of the worker nest and a lot of them below. And then of course they store pollen and honey up in the corners. So if we go back to the factors for survival, they have to be queen right, then they have to have lots of workers, and then they can raise drones. So drones being sort of third in priority for survival end up being raised toward the outside and the bottom of the nest. And like I just said, the 2 conditions for raising healthy adults are food and temperature. So who do you think is going to get more visits from the dining cart? It's sort of like if you're sitting in the middle of a restaurant, you get your coffee refilled more quickly. And if you're sitting out in the corner, you maybe don't. So the drones are out here where they might get less food attention. And then if there's a cold snap, who is going to be affected more? It's going to be the drones. And they're less important than the workers. So in a kind of cool way, the drones act as insulation for their more important sisters. The survival rate from egg to emergence for workers is about 85%, but it's only 55% for drones. And it's probably because of how they are raised in the nest. Now, if a hive, if you're using all foundation, the bees have to get a little creative to make their larger cells. And what you'll see in the spring is that they create drone comb anywhere you leave them some space, and it's typically between the frames between the supers. These are some actual drone cells on a foundation frame. You see the worker in the middle, and these drone cells, and it looks like bubble wrap. You can see these large cells looking like bubble wrap. And drone rearing generally happens during a nectar flow, but at all times the colony is constantly evaluating where to put their resources. And if they're raising a lot of brood, drone and worker, and conditions change, say there's a cold snap and it gets rainy and windy, or the food stops coming in, then the workers curb the amount of brood they're raising by eating eggs, larvae, and they'll even uncap and pull out pupae and eat them. And there's a term for this cannibalism that's called brood trimming. So workers trim the brood by eating it. And sometimes in a small colony, there just aren't enough workers to raise all the eggs the queen lays. You ever have a brand new queen and a little nuke, and you see eggs every day, but you just don't see a whole lot turning into larvae. And that's because the workers, there aren't enough nurse bees to care for it. So they're trimming the brood by gobbling it up. And it's astounding to think about all the feedback loops that are going on in a colony at any given time. Like, how does a worker know which brood to call? And how does she know what her sisters are doing in other places in the hive? It's just another one of those amazing mysteries that is kind of mind-blowing to think about how bees live like this in this amazing superorganism. Okay, so adult drones emerge. Bees aren't born, by the way, they emerge. They emerge fully formed with all the equipment they need to do their job, but they're still developing the first week or two after emergence, and they're not quite ready to mate. So the first 24 hours, they can't fly like workers and queens do. They're kind of marching around the hive, their cuticles hardening. For the first week, they're fed primarily by nurse bees, and they actually can feed themselves. You read, oh, drones can't feed themselves, but they can feed themselves. It's just that the food that they need more is they need more protein so they can continue to develop sexually. So they are fed the regurgitated contents of the workers' stomachs, and that contains pollen. By day 8, they primarily feed, they go up more into the supers, and they're feeding off of honey and feeding themselves primarily. For the first 12 days, their reproductive organs are maturing. So they come into the world with all the sperm they need, but it has to migrate from the testes to the seminal vesicles. And once it gets up there, it sort of matures. On days 6 to 9, they're going to take their cleansing flights, sort of like workers do in orientation. So they fly around and memorize the neighborhood, and they poop. And then starting at day 12, that's the earliest they are sexually mature, they can start going for their first mating flights. Now, drones have one job, and very few of the drones raised are going to get to fulfill their ultimate destiny, and that is to mate with queens from other colonies. So we're going to look at how drones are equipped for their one job and how they differ from workers. Compared to workers, drones are lacking in many ways. They have tiny mandibles. They don't need to be like chewing propolis and doing heavy lifting. They just need to be able to uncap a honey cell, so they're kind of small. They have a short proboscis. Again, they're not mining nectar out of deep flowers. They're just sipping honey from the cell, so they don't need that complicated tongue. Their tongue's about 3 millimeters compared to workers are 6 or 7. They don't have pollen collecting structures on their legs. They have a slender crop because then again, they're not making honey, so they don't need that multi-chambered stomach. They don't have wax, hypopharyngeal, or nasal glands. But what they do, and they also don't have a sting gland, and they can't sting you, which makes them super fun to work with. If you ever want to like freak out your friends who aren't beekeepers, you can grab a couple drones and put them inside your veil, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's a drone on your face. You're like, hey, no big deal. I can meet with my bees. So now I'm going to talk about how they are equipped to carry out their one job. Their antennae have 10 times the olfactory plates of workers. Now, y'all know what great sense of smell bees have. They have to be able to smell nectar from a blooming flower flying, 8 meters high. So the drones being able to smell 10 times better is kind of amazing. They have to be able to smell the queens because they mate while they're flying, and so they have this incredible sense of smell, and they have an additional segment on their flagellum on their antennae. They have much larger compound eyes. Again, they're mating with the queens while they're flying, and so they have to be able to spot her. They have a lot more facets, and the optic lobes of their brains are much larger to process that information. And their mandibles, though they be tiny, they do produce pheromones, and the pheromones are probably used by other drones to know that they're in a DCA, and they're probably used by the queens too to know that she's reached a DCA. And they have larger flight muscles because again, they're flying so hard, and their wings are broader because their main job is to mate while they're flying. So on this slide, this is bees mating in the sky, and it is completely blank because it's literally impossible to see with a naked eye. Honeybees are unique in their mating behavior because they mate while they're flying, as I've just said. And because of this, and because they're mate while they're flying and they're so far up, it's been really difficult to study for a long time. And because the drone's reproductive organs are internal. For hundreds of years ago, people thought, well, bees maybe just didn't mate at all. And it wasn't until the researcher figured out how to attach a kite to a queen so that they could take movies and track her that they really understood what was going on, because you cannot get bees to mate in a lab. They just won't do it. You can do it with bumblebees, but not honeybees. So it's been difficult to study. And what happens is the honeybees mate in these areas called drone congregation areas, or DCAs for short, and they're areas about 30 to 200 meters in diameter, where drones from many different colonies gather together and fly around, hundreds, if not thousands of drones, and they're looking for queens to mate with. And while they're flying around, they are filling with that mandibular pheromone that helps other drones know that they're there, kind of like when you walk in a bar and you smell beer and peanuts, it's like we're here. And so they fly around. They may fly, a single drone will fly to DCA and fly around, you generally got about 30 minutes in their tank if they suck up as much honey as they can. So they'll maybe spend 10 minutes flying out and then some time there and then fly back, and they'll suck up more honey and then they'll go back out either to the same or different DCAs. And from a single colony, the drones will be going to different DCAs at different times. So it's kind of like bar hopping. Drones, they usually leave the nest call mating flights in the afternoon. The books will say, 12, some books say 12 to 3, 1 to 4. What I found, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia, where it's so warmer, they fly later in the day. So they don't really start flying until 3. Even though I'll see drones leaving the hive at noon, I don't know if they're going on rotation flights or if they're just sort of early guys. But when I go out to DCAs, I don't really see them in large numbers until after 3 o'clock. So it really depends on where you live. There was a woman who did her master's work on DCAs at the University of Florida that I talked to, and she said she almost just gave up her project because she was going out there looking from like 12 to 2, and it wasn't until she started looking later that she discovered where the DCAs were. Now, the thing about DCAs is that they are mysterious because they remain the same year after year. They're constant. There's a DCA in Sheffield, England that is said to have bees in it since 1722, which is crazy. Now, the thing about drones is workers only raise them in the summer months, and in the fall, when the temperature turns, they pretty much cull the colony of any drones. Now, there's always somebody at these talks who's like, well, I've seen a drone in a hive in the winter when I do a quick check. And you will see 1 or 2. I think they probably just tell good jokes, but for the most part, they don't raise drones because they are a drain on resources, and there are no queens mating in the winter in the temperate world. So, so we don't know why it is that they come to these specific places. And the other thing that's interesting is they will pretty much stay within the boundary of a DCA. You can get out of it a few meters and have a queen there, and they won't chase her, which is just mind-boggling to think about. So there's something kind of magical going on. Now, there are some things that people observed about DCAs. One is that they tend to occur where there's a depression in the landscape. So bees are going to fly out from the colony, and they're more likely to head downhill than uphill, basically. So, so that's one clue. And that there are said to be visual clues, like they might follow a tree line or a river or something. And you will often read that a windbreak is important, that it's hard to fly in the wind, and that like an open area lined by trees makes a good windbreak. There's another theory that DCAs occur where there are magnetic anomalies, and which is a really interesting theory. So that's kind of interesting because we know that all bees have iron particles in their abdomen, and that workers will use magnetic fields to orient if they're sort of forced to not use anything else that they typically use. So this is a possibility. It's just very difficult to study. The paths that bees use to fly to DCAs and back and from one DCA to another is called flyways. They're called flyways. And on the right, this is a map of radar observations done of DCAs by Gerald Loper and his friends in Arizona. And this is really interesting because they used X-band marine radar. And because in Arizona, in this area, they're not tall hardwood trees. It's low lying and scrubby, so there wasn't a lot of growth in the way to get in the way of the radar, which is one reason why it's hard to use in other places. But the dots are the DCAs, and then these lines between them are the flyways. And you can kind of see where it's sort of going along this road, and it does follow some visual cues. So, however, there are also DCAs over forests that don't have these visual cues. And so there's a lot we don't know and understand about DCAs. But when they get to a DCA, what they're gonna do is they fly around, waiting for queens, and if a queen comes in the area, they can smell her and see her from like 50 feet. So as soon as there's a queen in the area, they smell that pheromone, they're gonna start flying and lining up in what we call comets. So they're flying these little comets, chasing the queens, and the strongest one that reached the strongest, fastest one is gonna meet, and they're gonna mate while flying in the air. And I hope this works. These are some videos of some DCAs where I have some queen more in this trap right here. And you can see this little dark spot. I'm going to follow it with my mouse. Those are comets right here, which is kind of cool to see. And I don't, when I first took these, I mean, I just took these videos with my phone. I thought, oh, maybe those are queens mating, but what I've learned is that the bees will, if there's pheromone in the air, they're going to chase anything that comes in the air. So it could be a butterfly or anything. They're gonna chase it. Okay. So given the opportunity, bees are gonna mate in the flyways, but inbreeding is not good for honeybees, as I mentioned earlier. And what's really cool is the mating process has several really interesting checks in place to discourage inbreeding. When drones leave that nest, they're going to fly about 26 meters off the ground, which is coincidentally about the height of hardwood trees, until they get to the DCA, and then they'll fly between, up to 75 meters off the ground. And queens, on the other hand, are going to fly about 8 meters above the ground, which is about 26 feet, and head out on their way. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the drones only have about 30 minutes of gas in their tanks. And chances are most of the drones are not going to get to mate with the queen, and they're going to be coming back and fueling up and heading out again. So drones tend to stick to DCAs closer to home because they don't want to expend that energy flying way, way far away. Now, queens, on the other hand, when they get to a DCA, there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands, of drones to mate with. So when she gets there, she can mate really quickly and get back. So she can expend the energy to go farther away, and she does. So she flies in the flyways at a lower height than her brothers. And then when she gets to a DCA, she's going to tend to go to DCAs farther away, which cuts down on her breeding with her brothers, which is just, isn't that the coolest thing? It's just amazing how honeybees have evolved these behaviors that cut down on inbreeding. So we'll talk about bee sex for a minute. Honeybee copulation is a complicated thing. And I said that it's done mid-flight on the go. They're flying about 12 to 15 miles an hour. And the queen she's in the DCA, and immediately, because of her strong pheromone, she attracts this comet of drones chasing her. And the drones are going to approach her from below. And once contact is made, it literally takes 2 seconds to mate with an individual drone. And what happens is the drones approach her from below. He grabs her with his first 2 pair of legs, and she has to open her sting chamber to accept this drone. And if she does that, then his endophallus, which is his reproductive organs, it's very complicated, it literally everts into her sting chamber. And this action of aversion paralyzes him. And he snaps backward, totally paralyzed. And the end of the endophallus actually separates. It doesn't rip or tear or here. It actually is made to separate, and it separates. And he falls down to his doom. He's paralyzed. He can't move. The endophallus takes up like 2/3 of his abdomen. So his abdomen is ruptured, but he's fulfilled his duty. He dies, and the end of the endophallus stays in the queen, and that takes literally 1 or 2 seconds. Then the next drone in line comes up, and he mates with her as well. What you read in books is that the average queen is mated with 12 to 20 drones, but Dave Tarby's lab at NC State, the queen lab, where you can mail your queens in and they'll dissect them and tell you how many different drones sperm a queen have. They've had queens with up to 77, mate with 77 different drones. So really numbers up in the 50s are more common than we ever knew before. So when the queen comes back, about 70% of the time, she will still have the end of the endophallus of the last drone she mated with lodged in her sting chamber. And we call this the mating sign. It's really cool if you can ever see it. And again, that's about 70% of the time. So the workers are gonna pull that out and clean her up. She needs to walk around when she's mated with all these drones. And so she needs about 6 million sperm. That's how many she can store in her spermatheca. But an individual drone will have like 3 to 11 million. So really, one drone in terms of quantity can do the job, but your colony's doomed if she only mates with one drone. We really need the multiple sperm to have genetic diversity and make a strong colony. So what happens is she mates with all these drones, and the sperm washes all the way up inside it. It just fills her whole abdominal cavity up into the oviducts. And the spermatheca just sort of sips up little bits of the sperm from each drone and mixes and stores, and she expels the rest, and then she's set for life. Like she's she's done. So there's always, sometimes there's a little bit of orange tip at the back of the endophallus, and that's kind of interesting. It actually means that there was another drone that tried to mate with her, because that orange stuff comes off their corona, which is not this part. So it means he was trying to get that out and he couldn't. So she comes back. Now, a queen might take more than one nuptial flight. It's usually done over a couple of days. We don't really know what signals are to come back, but it could be if she only mated with a few, then the next drones just couldn't get the mating sign out, so she might head back out, or like if the weather's bad and she didn't get finished, but she's typically done within a couple of days. Now, drones that don't get lucky and die, they'll fly around for half an hour, as I said, come back, make up honey, and set out again, go into several DCAs in the afternoon. But if mating doesn't kill him, the workers eventually will. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, by the end of the season, they don't need them anymore. But if resources are scarce and a dearth, workers will just refuse them entrance back into the hive. So they're not just calling drone brood, but if they can't feed the adults that they have, they will refuse them entrance. They're constantly assessing the needs and resources of the colony in some magical way. If they can't afford drones, they're not going to let them in. Now, you may have heard that drones are notorious drifters, and that's true. They colonies, we know that they're guard bees, right? And they sniff any workers coming in, and if they don't have the same smell as their hive, they're not going to let them in. But they are much more forgiving of drones. So it's like they just let the boys in. So there's much higher drift rate. So sometimes I think, it's like one colony is struggling, they don't let their drones in, then they'll go to a stronger colony and not let them in. Okay, so I want to encourage you all to make room for your drones. It's really important to let the bees raise them. And I'm going to tell you a couple ways to make that easier. Basically, you just have to give them room to build drone comb. And you'll probably, some of you are like, well, I'll just use worker foundation. And what they do is they just make the drone cells poke out more in that worker foundation. But it's really important to give them bigger cells, because if they're raised in a worker size foundation, even though they poke out and they're longer, they are going to be smaller drones, because the cell size has everything to do with how big they get. And smaller drones are known to be weaker flyers, and they're less likely to get to mate with the queens, and they have less sperm. So in terms of bees, bigger is definitely better. So you can buy a drone size foundation, and there's these all-in-one green Pure Coat frames that have drone size cells stamped into them. It's all plastic. If you want to use these, you really need to coat them with wax. I found that they're much more likely to build out if they're coated with wax, and they come in medium and deeps. And they're really used for varroa control, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it's a handy piece of equipment. But you don't even have to use special frames. What you can do is, if you use deeps, just put a medium or a shallow frame in your brood box, and they will, readily build out this big slab of drone comb, which is kind of cool to see. So the other thing you can do, even if you use all mediums, or even if you, aside from doing this, you could put a deep frame in and just pop the foundation out altogether. So you don't even need a starter strip or anything. If you put it between two brood frames, you can't put it between two honey frames. It has to be frames drawn with brood comb, with worker comb. So if you put that in the middle, like just in a blank frame, they will, because of bee space, they will start building this out, and they'll draw out drone comb. And an interesting thing is, they're only going to raise the drones that they need. And what they'll do typically is use these larger cells later in the season to store honey, which is more efficient. So it's an easy thing to do. Now, some of y'all are probably going, now, Julia, what about those varroa? Because varroa do prefer drone brood, which is interesting, because varroa evolved with Apis cerana, the eastern honeybee. And with Apis cerana, they've kind of evolved and they coexist. They don't kill colonies. And they only reproduce in drone brood in Apis cerana, which is really interesting. And the numbers just don't get too high. So they can smell drone brood that smells different to them than worker brood. And they will jump in drone cells before they jump in worker cells to reproduce. And so these frames were made for you to raise a bunch of drone brood, pull it out before they emerge, freeze it, and it kills the mites. And it also, so it traps the mites, and the reproducing mites, but it also obviously kills the drones. So what I tell y'all to, what I recommend that you do instead of just freezing it is because you don't want this to happen. I know this is really gross. It's like the worst picture ever. But what you can do is take your capping scratcher knife and just put it in there and pull out some drone brood and look at it. And if it's riddled with mites, absolutely stick it in the freezer. But if it's not, if like in a big chunk like this, you only see one mite, I would put it back in and let them raise it. And what you'll find is in the spring, the mites counts are lower. And as the summer goes on, you'll see more and more mites in it. So I typically will pull out and freeze the drone brood as the summer goes on when I check it. Because drones can't sting you, they make great test subjects for queen marking. You know, it's kind of anxiety producing to mark your queens because you don't want to squish your lower abdomen. So practice marking your drones. They can't sting you, and you can kind of get the feel for, because you want to hold them by the thorax, not the abdomen. And this can be a fun club activity too. You can catch a bunch of drones and have your members mark them. Pesticides are bad for bees. We all know that, right? But neonicotinoids are those systemic pesticides. But the exposure makes the drone sperm counts 39% lower, which is a real shame. So please be careful about what you're using in your homes. And you know, if you know any farmers, you want to communicate how important it is for bee health in your area. So how do you find DCAs? I know you're all dying to know. Historically, what researchers have done is they've used weather balloons filled with helium, or you can use a long pole, but weather balloons kind of work best. And you put that, so that balloon, it looks tiny, right? It's not Buddy Courtney on the ground. And this is kite string holding this weather balloon. The weather balloon is like 4 to 5 feet in diameter, so it's really huge. And this was, I waited for this day. I've like planned it for forever. We waited till the weather was right. It wasn't windy, it was calm, and it was obviously clear blue skies. And I had mapped out these places in my neighborhood. So this is a soccer field that's lined by trees. So like the things say, you need a windbreak. So it's open field lined by trees. We walked around, and up here is some artificial queen pheromone. And I'll tell you about the product of this in a minute. But so a queen pheromone to attract the drones. So this takes 2 people because I'm standing back here with the binoculars, and Courtney's holding the string. We walked around the soccer field for like an hour, didn't see a single insect. Then we went to a neighbor's yard that's also kind of like an open area lined by trees, nothing. And then we went to an apartment complex that has tall buildings with the parking lot is the open area, and we didn't see a single bee. It was really depressing. And helium is super expensive. Helium, there's a shortage, a worldwide helium shortage. It's a finite resource, finite gas, and the party cities in the world are using it all up. So it takes like over $100 to fill up a weather balloon like that. And that was a really depressing day. And I went home and told my husband, well, I didn't see anything, but I guess I'll just keep walking around with the helium balloon until it doesn't work anymore. And I went out the next morning, I got up and that balloon was dead on the ground. So I thought there's gotta be a better way. And I mentioned a pole, and people do get these like tall poles and put the lure up there, but that's also, it's kind of hard on your body to walk around with it for long, and it's not going to go under power lines and stuff. So it just doesn't make sense. And the other thing is with both these methods, you can only survey open areas. You can't survey areas over trees, right? Because the balloon's going to get caught in it, and you can't stand under it with the pole. So I worked on this this method to use mechanical drones, which I call UAV, because it just gets confusing. So when I talk about these cute fellas, I'm going to say drones. When I talk about this kind of drone, I'm going to call it UAV. So I got a UAV and I learned how to fly it, and tried a few different ways to attach the lure. What I ended up with is I'm using thin cotton thread to tie, you can't even see it, but between the feet here, you can see this thing dangling, that holds the lure. So you want something that this UAV has a camera that the camera can focus on, and something you can attach your lure to. And the lure that I use is this product called Temp Queen, and it's artificial queen mandibular pheromone, which is the sex attractant. So the sex attractant in honeybees is not the thing that smells like lemongrass. That is not going to work. This is a great product, though. I heard y'all talking about laying workers and queenless colonies in your mentor time. And this product is made for beekeepers to use if they have a queenless colony and they're ordering a queen, or they can't go pick one up for a week or two. You put this in and it keeps laying workers from developing. But it works great for this. You store it in the freezer. It's good in the freezer for like years. And so I just keep mine in my freezer when I'm not using it. And it's just a nice thing to have on hand too. It's not terribly expensive. It's a few dollars, maybe like under $5 per stick. One thing to attach it to is like a hair roller. So I experimented with different things, and you don't want something too heavy because it's going to swing back and forth. You want something that someone can pass through too, so that it won't act like a pendulum. And these hair rollers work great. You just peel off the fuzzy outer layer, attach it, and that's the thread. And you do want to use thin cotton thread. I worked with a professional UAV pilot. He wanted to get into beekeeping, so we kind of did a trade, and I think I came out ahead. He taught me all about flying, and he said, you don't want to use like fishing line or something strong, because if your lure gets caught on something, it's better to snap off and lose a few bucks in lure in a hair roller than crash your much more expensive UAV. So you want to use thin cotton thread. I use some jewelry already to attach it because I'm flying a lot, but you could just tie it on there. So one of the users on the website, Teresa Martin, told me she didn't want to go buy a bunch of hair rollers she didn't want, which makes sense. So she just took a prescription pill bottle and drilled some holes in it, and it works great. You want something to weigh between 7 and 15 grams or so. I thought that worked. I found that works. And then in terms of length, I was concerned about, so this is a view from my UAV, and that's my little weighted lure. You see the green stuff. The propellers on the UAV create wash or wind, and I didn't want to be flooding the area artificially with more than a queen flying through wood, which it turns out is not really a problem. But because of that, I flew my UAV over my head really slowly until I couldn't feel the wash on my face anymore. And that was at about 20 feet. So at about 20, so I try to have my string on my lure about 22 feet when I can. And as I mentioned, I don't think that the wash is really not an issue, but it is nice to have longer spread for another reason, which I'll tell you about in a second. The next thing is where you're going to look. Well, I personally have found that looking for those depressions in the landscape is helpful. So what you can do is you can go on Google Earth Pro. This is not Google Maps, but Google Earth Pro, and up here. And you go under settings, and there's something called elevation exaggeration. And when you bump it up, that's usually 0. You bump it up to the maximum of 3. When you move out on the map, you'll see like any little dip will look like a cliff drop off, and I've had some luck with that. Otherwise, you just kind of have to fly around. And I will admit, it can feel a little bit like looking for a needle on a haystack. Keep in mind the time of day, as I mentioned earlier. I don't know where in Texas y'all are, what your weather's like, but if it's a hot summers like it is in Georgia, you're going to want to go later in the afternoon. And time of day, what you might want to do is maybe map out 3 places and fly to one. If you're in a DCA, you're going to know within minutes. So you can fly around for 5 minutes, you don't find anything, go to a different one, and then circle back and come, like an hour or 2 later to all 3 and see what you see. Because I have definitely found that, they weren't there at 1, but they were definitely there at 3. So if you find, this is the zoom in of an image from my UAV. I was super excited. I was like, oh my gosh, I found a DCA. You see there's like 10 bees. So 10, 20 bees is not a DCA. 10, 20 bees is a flyway, and that's still great information because you're on the right path, right? So, but tens of drones is a flyway, but a true DCA has hundreds, if not thousands of drones. So this is a video of a DCA, and this is why it's important to have a long lure too, as you'll see when I hit play. But see these little white specks I'm pointing to? Those are drones, and this particular video, and then these are drones right here that are closer to the camera. So I hope this works. You never know via Zoom, but you can see how they're kind of trailing after each other. And also at first I thought I might need to fly the UAV 12, 15 miles an hour like Queen would be, but that's really not what, the whole point is just to see if you're in a DCA. So you see all these bees flying around. I hope this doesn't make you nauseated, but this is what a DCA looks like. And then, by the way, they're called these drones because of the roar of hearing them fly. And if you're in a DCA, I've been in a super popular DCAs in the spring where I could hear it, which is just amazing to witness. I just want to point out that, see this row, okay, there's this row here. This particular DCA, the next lot over is that soccer field that I showed you a picture from. You don't even know. Flew my drone over there like a million times. I was like, this is what a DCA should be. What I found in Atlanta is that DCAs happen many times over tree canopy. And then back to the balloon, I also mentioned going to a neighbor's yard that had like a whole an open area with trees in their backyard. I eventually found a DCA in the trees beside his yard, but they won't come over into the yard, which is crazy. Now, Atlanta has a lot of tree canopy with city of trees, but what I'm finding is that I think that the reason why they say that DCAs happen in an open area with a windbreak is because that's the easiest place to monitor. I've also found that drones are flying way high. They'll go up to 400 feet in the air. And so this whole thing about a windbreak just doesn't really make sense. So there's the video again. So I have this website. This is my citizen science project that I created, and I posted it and it came live in December of 2019. And I was going to do a bunch of B talks in 2020, and then 2020 happened. It turned out to be a great thing because now I can like talk to you guys in Texas, and you don't have to pay for my plane ticket. So this is the website. It's called Map My DCA. You can click on these things up here and you can read about drones, about DCAs, and how to find them, kind of the same stuff I've outlined to you this evening. And then if you go back to the homepage and you can click on View the DCA Map, and on that map, you will see places where people have pinned drone congregation areas, which is super exciting. You can use any method you want. These international ones are researchers that I reached out to, who've done their own work, and I said, hey, would you look at the website, give me feedback, and also would you pin your DCA? So it was kind of exciting that they did. So there are, anyway, so if you roll over, if you zoom in and roll over a pin, what you see is, if you roll over the pin, this little window pops up with details. So if you click on that, you can read the information that the person uploaded. So this one I found, the dates, all this information is sort of optional, but down here it says YouTube video display. So I've posted YouTube videos of the DCAs that I found, and you can go click on those if you, I don't know if it was too jerky on the screen for y'all, but you can look at some of those things. So the idea is I'm trying to create a database of drone congregation areas, and it's actually a Google map. And with all the tools that Google Maps coming out with, we might be able to figure something out just by looking at them on the maps. Anyone can download all the data at any time, and hopefully the database will get built up, and we can really better understand them when we have more DCAs to work with. It's amazing how many researchers, really people talk about DCAs, but they really don't know what they are. Not that many people know. I mean, obviously people do DCA research. But anyway, one thing I don't address on the website is how to responsibly pilot UAV. You really have to know what you're doing, because you fly over a roadway and crash, you could cause a horrible accident to happen. So it's really important to take the time and train yourself and learn how to fly responsibly. And I don't know what the laws are in Texas, but in Georgia, it's actually legal for you to fly over private property so long as your feet are in public property. So I can stand in the road and fly over my neighbor's house and not be within my rights of the law. But sometimes it might not be well received, so it might be met with suspicion. I was flying like a mile from my house in a subdivision one afternoon, and I'm standing in the street, and this pickup truck goes up, and this guy's like, not even a hello, he's just like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh, actually, I'm doing some honeybee research, but I don't want to offend you, so let me just land my UAV and I'll get out of your hair. And he was like, what do you mean bee research? And so I kind of explained the broad strokes, and his people will do. He's like, well, I know a beekeeper. And I said, yeah, who do you know? I'm like, no. So, oh, no, she doesn't live in Atlanta. She lives up in Cumming. I know her from kayaking. And I said, Kelly Campbell. And he was like, oh, well, actually, yeah, it is Kelly Campbell. So he ended up asking me to fly my drone back up, take a picture of his house and send it to him. But I'm driving home, again, I'm just a mile away, and I get this text from my friend Kelly with a screenshot. And she's like, is this you, Law? And what he wrote was, some bee lady was flying a drone over her house today saying she was looking for male honeybees zooming over my treetops, WTF. She said she knew you, so I figured she had to be cool, so I didn't shoot her. So the lesson here is, like in Texas, people in Georgia love their guns, and you just want to be careful. You want to always be, I mean, we're all ambassadors for bees all the time, but you want to be respectful. You don't want to make people uncomfortable with your UAV. But if you have a UAV, or even if you have a kid or a friend with a UAV, I encourage you to go out and look for drone congregation areas. Another thing you can do is you can reach out, just like we have a bee club. These UAV pilots have their own clubs. And so you can reach out to, if anytime I meet someone that says they have a UAV, I say, have you ever felt that your UAV was attacked by drones? Because the drones are attracted to the motors. They fly up into it, which, and I think it's like defensive behavior, because it's really odd. It should be hard for them to get up at it. And I will tell you right now, you will get a few chopped up in the propellers. It's kind of gross and you feel bad, but it's not like a big slaughter. It's just a little bit. But they are attracted to it. So if you go on YouTube and you put in drones, bees, you'll see a bunch of Florida videos where people are like, honeybees attacked my drone trying to protect queen. And it's not a swarm, it's a DCA. You can kind of tell by looking at them what's happening. So that might be one way to find a DCA. You could say, have you ever had this happen? If you do, let me know. And then you can go back out and you can listen, especially in springtime, you can hear them pretty well, or you can, get somebody with a UAV and go up there and try to get it. That is the end of my talk. These are some of the references if you want to look up any of those things that I had listed. Follow me on the things. I'm at my DCA, and this is my contact information. And I'm happy to take any questions. I don't know if they're in the chat or what, but do y'all want me to leave this up for a second, or are there questions in the chat? Let me see, maybe not.
Yes, Julie, if you could leave that up for everyone, and if we could all give Julia a round of applause, please. Anybody have any questions for Julia about the presentation? All right, we got one question from Natalie. Julia, can you hear us?
I can.
Okay, good. What if we want, as a Beekeepers Association, try to get our beekeepers engaged and trained into locating their own DCAs in the area as a research project, for example? What would you recommend, and can you help us?
What I recommend is what?
And can you help us? we're doing what we're doing, so.
Yeah. Well, I think that the simplest thing is to find someone who already has a UAV and wants to have a reason to fly it. And you'll find that people do. They're into it, and they want a task. They want a challenge, So you could find someone with a UAV. Also, the one that you saw in my picture, mine is kind of an expensive one. It's a pretty good model, but you can get them for less. And there was one on Amazon that's around $100 that worked. But I ordered one that was like $50 on Amazon just to see if it would work, and it was a total disaster. The most important thing is that it has a camera that you can see from your controller. So a lot of them, you plug it into your smartphone and you use that as a camera. But I ordered one that had a camera, but it only recorded it while it was flying. You couldn't see it in real time, and you want to see what's happening where you are. But you can find more inexpensive ones. But the thing is, a lot of the mini drones, the really tiny ones, the propellers are really close to the ground, and you don't want to get that thread caught in your propellers, which has happened to me. So the nice thing about the taller ones is that it's farther away. But I do have a little Mavic Mini drone, and there's it's like a sled legs that you can buy that attach to the bottom. So it's sort of like it looks like a seaplane, sort of these little like sled things that it lands on. So I recommend trying something like that if you get one of the tiny UAVs. So I mean, buying a UAV for your club might be an undertaking you're not willing to do, but maybe you could find someone with one. And then if you have a club apiary, you could, you just start in your apiary and start flying around in a radius in the apiary wherever you can access it. And I will tell you, sometimes it can feel like looking for a needle in a haystack. I flew for like a couple months and I wasn't finding anything. And then I found a DCA, and within 2 weeks, I found 2 more. So, but it's so cool when you finally find one. I find it really rewarding. So I would do what I mentioned earlier, reach out to any UAV associations. You know, there are these drone clubs, and then talk to all the drone clubs. You know, get on Facebook in your area and see if they have a Facebook users group. And then y'all can go in together as a club and buy the Temp Queen. You can get like a multi-pack from Man Lake, and you all can, you know, share the lure. And again, it keeps in the freezer forever. The guy who was my UAV flying mentor, actually, I gave him some, and I told him, you just keep this in the freezer. And he told me later that he just left it on his garage floor for a year and it still worked. But so, you know, just it would definitely be a fun thing. I will tell you, I just want to warn you that it might take a while to find one. Then my friend Teresa, who posted the one in, who I became friends with just because of this project, because she was just corresponding with me a lot. She found one her second time out. So start at your apiary and then go out in a radius if you can. It could be as close as like 500 feet. Like it could be close. But just keep in mind, if you see tens of drones, you're in the flyway. If you're in a true DCA, you're going to see hundreds, if not thousands. And it's not too late. I found my first ones in August and September. And when I went back then in the spring to those same locations, they were much more populated, but they were still had a lot of drones in them. In fact, in 2019, we had like a heat wave that year. And then usually in September, it cools off, but it's still pretty hot. And by October, we're having, you know, the weather's really broken, and it's no longer like in the 80s. But that year, that first week in September, we had a day that was 98 degrees, and there were still some drones in those DCAs. I was flying. Yeah, I flew like twice a week in the ones that I was monitoring carefully just to see, and it really wasn't until the second week of October. So you can still find them this year, and if you do find one, it's probably really strong. And when you go back in the spring, it'll be really amazing as well.
Very good, thank you. I actually just got a DJI-2 mini for my birthday, so I'm planning on using that. Yeah,
that'd be awesome. Yeah. So see if you can find that little sled attachment to tie the thread to, so it doesn't get caught in your propellers. And if you want, you can email me and I can send you a link.
Sled attachment, yes. Very good, thank you. Anybody else?